This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Today, we all know that in America, there is a battle going on about what's really happening in the Middle East. And it's a battle happening in the hearts and the minds of millions of Americans across our country. And it's a serious battle, because the results of this battle decide many of the votes of Americans in elections, and decide also where their support goes and their sentiments. And the survival of Israel is dependent on it. And in particular in our campuses, there's a very serious battle, a battle going on for the future minds, the leaders of America, as to whether or not to support the Palestinians or to support Israelis. And unfortunately, in many situations, the argument of the Israelis defending the right of Israel to have a state of its own is losing. Now, this is a very serious issue. We have with us today somebody who's going to help us discuss this. And before I introduce him, I want to just show you an ad. It's not a very good copy, but hopefully we can get you a little bit of an idea of what's going on the campuses today. The types of ads that are going on to the bulletin boards and that are filling the minds of young students on campus. Who is the aggressor in Palestine? A picture of the occupied being a young boy throwing a rock, or else the occupier, an Israeli soldier. And of course, what is the caption? Stop blaming the victim in the occupation. This is an ad that's put out by the Arab American Friendship League, the Anti-Discrimination Committee. And it reflects the type of tremendous campaign that is being waged on our college campuses for the minds of young people all over. I want to introduce to you Mr. Samuel Bahn, who is an Israeli consultant, or a consultant for really Israeli issues and affairs for many Jewish organizations here in New York, who will discuss with us some of the issues about what exactly is the argument. If you've got children in college, or you want to know yourself, how do I argue the point for Israel to understand what is really happening, and how do I stand up for what Israel's rights are? Go get yourself a copy, put it into your tape recorder so you can make sure that you know, and you can review these points over and over again. We'll give you some information at the end of the show also, so that you'll be able to get onto the web and be able to find out a lot more of information in order to be able to have a full range of ammunition to be able to fight the fight that Israel needs you to fight. Mr. Bahn, it's been a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much.
And I want to welcome you to the Jewish Spotlight, and I look forward to a very interesting half hour.
I'm looking forward myself.
Let's start off by talking about some of the misconceptions that are out there. There are so many misconceptions. How do you initially go to an individual and talk to them about some of these misconceptions to show them how the basis upon which so much of the presentation of the Palestinian position is based on hot air, is based on false perceptions, misconceptions of all types? How do you present that?
Well, the ad that you showed not only appears on college campuses, has appeared in major media around the country over the last year and a half. And these misconceptions are part of a campaign by the Arab world against Israel. And it is very much encapsulated in the ad. Who was the aggressor in Palestine? And when you hear the word Palestine, that should be a trigger for you, because you say, well, where is Palestine? And Palestine doesn't exist. It went out of business in 1948 when the British partitioned what was then Palestine into Israel.
But of course they refused to use the word Israel,
and
which is another part of the
problem.
problem.
The Arabs did not accept it.
Right.
So there's no Palestine, and that's a code word today. So that should put you immediately on your guard, and that should be part of the argument, because there is no Palestine. We say, who is the aggressor in Palestine? The occupied or the occupier? And the occupied is shown as a kid throwing a stone. The occupier is shown as an Israeli soldier.
Using an Uzi.
With an Uzi. So it's a kind of an inversion. The child against the Nazi. The Jew against the Nazi. There's
the
an
poor,
inversion.
defenseless Palestinians who have no option and no choice except to try to pick up stones and throw them at this powerful army.
That's correct. And so that's the perception that is being sold in this particular ad, and that has to be kept in mind, that Palestinians are not fighting with stones. Palestinians today are fighting with bombs. And
Right.
Palestinians are fighting with weapons that they were given as part of the Oslo Agreement. And the Israeli, armed Israeli is not the entire picture of Israel. Israel is an extremely humane state. But this is the image that we're being fed.
To take this a little step further, if we can get a close-up of this, there's a beautiful map over here, and I don't think everybody's really aware of how much of a victim Israel is. People think that Israel is really the Goliath and the Palestinians are the David fighting this monster. Can we get a close-up on this? Here we have a picture. We see Israel. Israel is basically this size. This is a picture of all of the Arab land. Here you have on the bottom a picture of Israel in California, and here it would be compared to New Jersey. Basically, you're talking about a piece of land that is so minute, with a population so small compared to the Arab world, and we're being called the Goliath. It's just such an incredible thing that there is this effort to totally change the details of what is happening here.
And they've been very effective.
Very
in it,
effective.
And this is where the danger is to not only students but to adults as well.
And I think all of it is really to tap into emotions. It's not really based on facts, on historical things that we can see from the UN resolutions, from the history of the Palestinian people, the history of Israel. It's really just to hit us in the emotions to create sympathy.
It does trigger emotions because the word occupation triggers the emotion of the Nazi occupation
Sure.
in Europe.
It's a very negative term.
So who are the occupiers? The Israelis are the Nazi occupiers, and the Israelis are portrayed here in the Nazi mode, and the Palestinians portrayed as the helpless.
Right.
So the question is, how would you respond to this? I think this is what we would like to talk about.
Yes.
And so, number one, the issue of Palestine. Number two, stop the occupation. Now, this ad came out after the Oslo process went into in 1993, went through the entire Oslo process, and Israel in the Oslo process handed over governance of the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority governs 97% of the Palestinian people today. And so from that point of view, there's no occupation whatsoever, from the point of view of who's governing who. In other words, we accept the word occupation as if the Palestinians say we're occupied, so we accept it. And the question is whether they are occupied. They're not occupied in terms of who's governing them. Israel did govern them before '93, but now it's the Palestinian Authority that governs them.
Right.
In terms of land, much land has been turned over to the Palestinians, but and more would have been, but there was violence. But what is the basis of the Oslo Agreement? Land for peace, right? Israel has turned over land. Israel has given 97% of the Palestinians over, except for a few in Jerusalem, to the Palestinians for governance. Has Israel gotten peace? No. Have the Palestinians kept their security obligations under Oslo? No. Therefore, Israel is obliged to go into the territories to keep peace.
To do what their security forces were supposed to do, according to Oslo.
Which is what their security forces were supposed to do.
So we're just enforcing what they were supposed to do themselves. Exactly.
Right. Therefore, Israel has an obligation and a right to keep peace, and so their soldiers have gone into the territories. This is not an occupation. So when they say end the occupation, what are they talking about?
Right. It's a figment of their imagination. Let's talk about something else also, the right of return, for instance. I'm sorry, I just want to jump around to a couple of the different terms that are used here. The right of return, which is supposedly one of the major problems that Arafat had when they were trying to make this last settlement with Barak, is also a creation. It's a nice term, the right, as if they have a right to return. They started a war, they lost the war, they lost what they had, and as a result, who says there's a right all of a sudden to return? And this has become the major stumbling block of trying to make peace.
It is a major block, and it's been raised by the Palestinians, and it's been very cleverly raised as a right. They claim a right of return. And so everybody says, well, yes, there must be a right of return if they say there's a right of return.
Where's that right come from?
But the right has to come from someplace. And what actually happened when you go back to the record was that the Palestinians started a war after the UN partitioned Western Palestine back in 1947 into an Arab and a Jewish area. The Israelis accepted the partition, the Arabs rejected it, and initiated a war. In the course of that war, many Palestinians became refugees. I should say Palestinian Arabs, because at that time there were Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs living in Palestine.
Right.
And the Palestinian Arabs became refugees. Other Palestinian Arabs chose to live in peace with Israel. And today they are Israel's Arab citizens.
Right.
And there were over 1 million of them. Therefore, there
And
was
they've prospered. They've lived
and-
much better than the Palestinians have outside of Israel.
and they have more rights than any Arabs and any Arabs in the entire Middle East.
Right.
So the Palestinian Arabs who chose to make war with Israel, many of them left, others were forced out in the course of battles which were taking place for Israel's very existence. This was a war that the Arabs said was a war of extermination. And Israel lost 1% of its population, 6,000 people in this war. And so many Palestinian Arabs became refugees as a result of a war that they started. So to go from there to right of return is an interesting jump. And it's interesting that we have accepted that and that we've permitted that terminology to
be used.
Right. Israel does not give away land so easily. They're very concerned about the land issue. But the public relations terminology and concepts sometimes are more easily given away. And I don't think that they should be.
Let's talk a little bit about now the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was really founded, incidentally, in what year was it?
1964.
64, before the 67 war.
Yes.
So it was founded for the express purpose of the destruction of Israel, and it's before they lost the 67 war and before they so to say were out of that area that they now claim should be their Palestinian state. They weren't interested in peace then, and similarly they're not interested in peace now. And Arafat has made it clear over and over again what his goals are, as have many of his Arab constituencies. So as a result, we're dealing with a situation where there's a people who are bent on the destruction of Israel, and Israel has over and over and over again, through every single situation, only wanted to have a partner in peace, to be able to finally bring this chapter to a conclusion and live in peace with its neighbors. But there's nobody to talk to. So again, the tables have been turned to make it seem as if we're the ones who are the aggressors, we're the ones who are, as this ad shows, the occupiers.
And going back to 1947, when Western Palestine was partitioned into between an Israeli area and an Arab area, and the Palestinians, the Mufti Husseini, who was Arafat's predecessor, refused a state at the time, much as Arafat did at Camp David in June of 2000, refused a state when an opportunity was presented to have a state in a negotiation at that time. Now, when the Palestinians refused a state back in 1947, the Arab armies invaded Israel with the intent of destroying her, and they were rebuffed, thankfully. And what happened as a result of the 1948 war? Jordan took over the West Bank, and Egypt took over the Gaza. And this was what they talk about today, Israel occupying those areas. I don't believe that they're occupying them. I think that they're disputed territories. But certainly, Jordan had no business being in the West Bank at the time. That was area that was given over for an Arab state, and Gaza also. So Egypt had no business being there. They made no attempt to give the Palestinian Arabs a state of any sort of a government, self-government at that time. In fact, in Egypt, they kept them virtual prisoners. In the West Bank, Jordan did make them citizens of Jordan, which is very interesting because some people say that Jordan is really a Palestinian state, and they made the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank citizens. But from 1947, 1948 till 1967, those lands were in Arab hands. The PLO, as you mentioned before, was founded in 1964, while the West Bank was in the hands of Jordan and Gaza was in the hands of Egypt. The question is, why didn't the PLO go to Jordan and go to Egypt and say, let's have a Palestinian state.
Exactly.
If that were their
Very
intention.
good point.
But they didn't. Instead, they did terrorism against Israel, and the record of that, Munich and the attacks in Ma'alot, and
Right, many different locations.
the record is very clear. Until the PLO came back, and Arafat came back in 1993 with the Oslo Accord, and had an opportunity then to void the history and to make real peace with Israel. And it culminated in Camp David in 2000, at which point Arafat walked out of Camp David, did not make a counteroffer to a very generous offer that Prime Minister Barak had made at the time, where he had agreed to dismantle some of the settlements, trade land for other settlements, because the settlements has been a major issue. And Arafat walked out of that and instead started what is today a war. And they misname an intifada. It's not an uprising, as there was an uprising in 1988 by the Palestinians, but today's is not an uprising. It's a war of aggression by the Palestinians.
Incidentally, you mentioned concerning Arafat, and I think we need to concentrate a little bit on what his role in all this is, because obviously he's a major player. And it makes me so upset when I hear some of the arguments that are brought forward on all these issues, because when it comes down to it, Arafat has a personal wealth of $1.3 billion. The man has received billions and billions in foreign aid. He has deliberately kept his people oppressed in order to be able to create the sympathy factor for the world media. If anything, the Intifada should be against him, not against us. The Jews have treated the Arabs that are in the land of Israel very, very well. He's treated his own people as in such incredible cruelty when he's sitting on billions of dollars, and the money that he does spend, he spends it on arms and spends it on his security guards. And why? In order just to be able to show that these are oppressed people, so we'll have a goal to be able to work towards, to liberate the oppressed people. They should be going to him to be able to get their freedom.
Very interesting point. That ad that you held up at the beginning of the program, who is the aggressor in Palestine, the occupied or the occupier, there should have been a third picture in there, which would be the Palestinian Authority, and maybe even a fourth picture in there, the Arab states, because there's a very strong case that the real oppressors of the Palestinian people is the Palestinian Authority itself.
And the Arab states who don't want the Palestinians, they don't want to help them, they haven't done anything for them.
And they've used them throughout the years.
Exactly.
Whereas in 1947 and 1948, we talked about the refugees and the right and the so-called right of return. A story that's not too well known is that there was an equivalent number of Jewish refugees from Arab countries who were thrown out of Arab countries as the result of what I believe to be Arab pique at losing the 1948 war to the Jewish state.
Right.
Now, what happened to these refugees and what happened to the Palestinian refugees? Just take a look at the two sets of refugees. The Jewish refugees were brought by the Jewish community of the world and Israel, mostly to Israel. They were in camps in the first few years. They had it very tough, but they were given opportunities. They were given homes eventually.
They were absorbed.
They were absorbed and integrated. The Palestinian refugees were kept in refugee camps by the Arab countries and by the Palestinian Authority itself, or the PLO at that time, to be used as a stick, as a weapon against Israel. And today we see them coming out and saying we want our right of return. Under the UN resolutions, but the UN resolution that gives an opportunity for return maintains that the people who come back have to be willing to live in peace. And the way that the tone of the people who want that right of return doesn't sound at all as if they are at all interested in peace. So you have the juxtaposition of the two groups of refugees, and this is a story that people don't know about today.
I think take it one step further also. The Saudi kingdoms and the governments of all of these different Arab countries have used Israel's presence in the Middle East as the focus of all the dissatisfaction of any of the Arabs from throughout the Arab world, where this has become the common enemy, and it's united the Arab world tremendously. Without Israel in the Arab world, I would hate to see what they were doing to each other.
Right. Israel has become the Arab scapegoat.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
And the Arab billions of oil money, which could have been used
Sure.
to help the Palestinian
they could have a
refugees,
tremendous life.
were not used.
Not at all. And these people live in hovels, and they blame the Israelis for it, when in fact Arafat and the rest of the Arab world is sitting on all the money. Just, I want to jump over. You know, there a lot of times we hear on the radio and terms that the president uses and many people use as far as UN amendment this and UN resolution that concerning Israel and all of the UN resolutions. Could you help clarify for us a little bit? You mentioned a few of them, but what exactly is the status of those resolutions? What supposedly is the Middle East supposed to look like according to the composite of all of those resolutions?
Well, after the 67 war, there was UN Resolution 242, and after the 73 war, there was UN Resolution 343. And 242 was essentially land for peace. But the Arab states, another misconception is that the Palestinians were somehow have a right to the West Bank and the Gaza because they were somehow involved in the war, or where their right comes from. They gave up their right in 1947 by not accepting the partition. The land was invaded by Jordan and by Egypt, and annexed by Jordan and administered by Egypt. The war in 1967 was fought by Egypt and by Jordan and by Syria. The Palestinians were not party to that. And so Resolution 242 calls for land for peace. And Israel was supposed to give up territories, not all of the territories, but give up territories in return for peace. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened with Egypt.
Right.
Israel gave up Sinai and got a peace treaty from Egypt. And so the Oslo Agreement was supposed to be that, with the Palestinians who were to take over to that area. They were given the opportunity through the Oslo Agreement to make peace with Israel and to get land. But they have abrogated that agreement. And so the land after 1967 that Israel was sitting on in the West Bank and Gaza, Israel didn't see themselves as occupiers of that land, because that land was land that Jordan had gained through aggression in 1948, and Egypt had gained through aggression, and Israel was attacked in 1967. So Israel gained that land in a defensive war. And they weren't occupying the land, they were holding the land until UN Resolution 242 would be implemented, and they could exchange land for peace. So the idea of occupation going back to 1967 is an invalid idea that could be challenged.
Interesting.
And the term that Israelis use is disputed. Mm-hmm. But that hasn't gained credence, and it should. It should be used more, and people should look into that history, because the sense of occupation is what the Palestinians use to justify their violence against Israel.
Exactly.
So it all comes around.
It all comes back to that. Tell me, let's go into a little bit of the history of the Palestinian people. What does it mean that these are Palestinian people? There was never a nation of Palestinian people. There was a nation of Palestinian people. What are we talking about when we say that they had this right to return as if this is their land? To what do they credit this right?
We often hear about Palestinians and Palestine, and people will make the connection that Palestine, which was the British mandated Palestine from 1917 to 1948, was a place that Palestinians lived. We assumed that there were Palestinians. We assumed that there were today's Palestinians who were living in Palestine at the time.
Now, were those Palestinians just regular Arabs who just happened to live in Palestine, or was there a special governmental structure that they took on? Was there a cultural difference?
The Palestinians who were living in Palestine from the time of the British Mandate until 1947, when Palestine was went out of business effectively,
right,
were two types of Palestinians: Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs.
Okay.
The Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, called themselves mostly Arabs and not Palestinians. The word Palestinian, as we know it today, really didn't come into currency until the 1960s.
Really?
Palestinians back in the early part of the century were Palestinian Jews and Arabs. Now, the word Palestine came from the Roman designation when the expulsion took place after the destruction of the temple back 2,000 years ago. The word Palestine was used by the Romans because it was the Philistines was the basis of the word Palestine,
right.
and they named it Palestine in order to try to disassociate a Jewish connection to the land of Israel, where the Jews had lived for hundreds and thousands of years before that expulsion. And so that word Palestine came into existence then, but there was never a country of Palestine. There was never a country of Palestine.
Right, so this idea of having a right of return to a piece of land,
It's a piece of land.
It's a political ploy, basically, to try to put another element into the whole complicated challenge that we're dealing with today.
It's a complicated element, but what we get is the attempt to juxtapose today's Palestinians with the word Palestine and give them some ancient credibility, and that's incorrect history.
Right. Okay. I want to thank you very much, Mr. Bahn. It's been fascinating. I'm sorry we can't go on. I could go on in this for hours, of course, because the amount of information that we have to deal with is just mind-boggling. There is, of course, there are a number of websites that people can go to in order to be able to get more information. They can email to you. I believe the email address has been up on the screen. You have a book of which I think you'd like to recommend, also Myths and Facts.
Myths and Facts,
A Guide to the Arab-Israeli Conflict by Mitchell Bard, published by Ellie E. Hertz. This is put out by the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. Anybody can verify any of the information there with historical facts. I'm sure it can stand on its own 2 feet. In addition, this publication I use to show you the map has some very interesting other information which is made specifically sometimes for campuses. It's put out by www.standwithuscampus.com, or to get more brochures, if you'd like to get this brochure, which gives really an overview of the situation with some very interesting details and facts, myths. And this is all from standwithus.com/order. And it goes into some fascinating information just to unravel so many of the absolute myths that people are living with, which unfortunately is being used by some members of the press and many of the people on campuses and those with minds who were not yet totally familiar with the full history of Israel and the Palestinian people over the last 50 to 100 years. So I would strongly recommend go out there, become an educated consumer, find out what's really going on in Israel. Don't just accept whatever you hear or whatever people tell you and just sit back and say, okay, listen, it sounds good, these people are oppressors, I'm a nice kind of guy, I like the victim and the small little guy, so I'm going to vote for the Palestinians. It doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't be so simple. Become an educated individual. Meantime, thank you again, Sam. I really appreciate you being with us on the show. We'll see you next week, same time, same station, at the Jewish Spotlight. Shalom. Take care of yourself.
Simchu besimchas hagiulu, hine hine Moshiach.